All right, now we have these functions, and we want to try to use what we know about exponential functions to graph the function, graph the parent function, and then perform the transformation. So let's start with the parent function. I'm going to write this over here. If I want to find out the parent function here, or in other words, if I strip all of the transformations away from this function, our parent function could change depending on our base. So here our base is 3. If I take away all the transformations, then I would just be left with 3 raised to the x power. That's going to be our parent function. Now that's important. I'm going to go ahead and scale it while I'm talking. That's important because now from that, based off of the video, the previous video and what we did on the front page, we can get 2 critical points, 2 key points. I don't want to say critical. 2 key points for our function, and then use the transformations that we know how to apply to actually get our actual function. So here, this function 3 to the x, I'm going to go ahead and graph this with a dotted line. Same thing we do in the previous graphing lessons, if you will. We know that if we plug in 0, we're going to get the value 1, so it's going to go through 0, 1. We also know if we plug in 1, it's going to go through 3. 3 raised to the 1 is 3, so it would be at 1, 1, 2, 3. As it moves to the right, it's going to go towards infinity, so it's going to have this shape. And as we go towards the left, it's going to go like that. So that's our parent function. Now in class, we talked about what transformations are happening up here. If this is our parent function, which is true, then what is the +2 and the -1 telling us? And a lot of students were able to say, hey, the -1, it's you know, outside of a function. That means it's going down 1, which is true. What about the +2? Well, here, what's inside of our function, you think about what's happening to x. What's quote unquote inside or in the parentheses is technically what's happening in our exponent. So you can think about this +2 as happening quote unquote inside of our function. And if we think about what's inside of our function here, this would actually be shifting to the left 2 because it's +2 quote unquote inside of our function. So we move it to the left 2. So we move down 1, left 2. Move all of our points to that. Down 1, left 2. Boom, we got a point there. Down 1, left 2. Boom, you got a point there. Now, we also have to be careful here because we had originally a horizontal asymptote here on the x-axis. Excuse me. But we shifted our function to the left 2 and down 1. So this asymptote, because we moved everything down 1, also shifts down 1. So we no longer have a horizontal asymptote on the x-axis. It goes down to -1. So our function should look something like this. And then as it goes this way, it's going to get close to the asymptote but never touch. So that's our function. Now, we want to talk about domain, range, all that stuff. Here, we can talk about domain. It's still -infinity to infinity. It's going forever in both directions. If we think about range, well, this function here is approaching -1, but it never touches, and then it goes on towards infinity. So our range here, the lowest value, it doesn't touch -1, but gets really close to it, and then it goes forever towards infinity. We already said we have a horizontal, I'm just going to write horizontal asymptote at y equals -1 because we had to shift the function down 1. And if we want to talk about end behavior here in the negative direction, we can say that as x goes towards -infinity, as we continue moving towards the left, well, if I take this function and I move along the function towards the left, again, it's getting really close to, but never touching -1. So our function is approaching -1. Same thing if we move in the right-hand direction. Well, not the same thing. If we move here in the right-hand direction, we can say as x goes towards infinity, our function, as we go to the right, continue moving along that function, it's going to continue increasing, it's never going to stop, and it's going towards infinity. So these are our key features for this function. I'm going to talk about the graph of this function, transform it, and let you determine the key features on your own. But here, we're talking about the parent function. We're talking about the base raised to the exponent. Well, our base here is that e that we talked about in the previous video. E raised to the x. So we can graph that as our parent function. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we know, again, it's going to go through 0, 1. But if I plug 1 in here, it's e raised to the 1, which will just give us e. But e is 2.71, around 2.7. So at 1, the x value 1, we can go up 2.7, 1, 2, and a little more than a half, and that's fine. And so our parent function will look something like this. Remember, we have that horizontal asymptote here at the x-axis. Now, what's happening to the transformation? What transformations are we applying here? Well, to start, because of the -1 with the x here, we are going to shift to the right one. So this tells us to shift right. And because we're multiplying our parent function by a negative value, we're going to reflect. Now, we have to be careful with our reflections here in a second. Here, because of the negative multiplied by the parent function, if you want to write that down, that might be a good thing. Because our parent function is being multiplied by a negative, we're going to reflect across the x-axis like we have been. So we're going to have to reflect this function across the x-axis and shift it by 1. I'm going to go ahead and reflect it first. So if at this point, if I reflect it across the x-axis, instead of it being at 0, 1, it's going to be at 0, -1. At this point, instead of being at 1, 2.7, it's going to be 1, -2.7. So I'm going to try and do a longer dotted line. Will look like this. We can ignore this function now. We reflected it, so we did that. Now notice our asymptote didn't change. It's still approaching 0, just coming from the bottom, but never touching. And now we shift it to the right one. So at this point we go here. Well, I'll do that in red. Here to that point, here, move it over to the right one, and then draw our function. And there it is. Now, I want you to think conceptually and try to do the key features on this one on your own. If you come up with it, that's fine. If you have questions about it, please let me know. Next video, I'm going to show one more transformation in numbers 3 and 4, and then that'll be the last video.